Today I want to discuss a kind of fun and interesting sutta from the Pāli tradition. It's one that I think expresses how we're supposed to approach the teachings of the Buddha. Are we supposed to approach them basically as philosophy, or are we supposed to approach them as a kind of literature, as poetry, we might say? Basically, the question for us is, when we come to the Buddhist Dharma, when we come to reading the suttas or trying to understand Buddhism, are we supposed to try to clarify exactly what's meant in a particular sutta or by a particular claim or expression or example? Or instead, are we supposed to try to understand it, or I should say interpret it, come to it as a kind of a literary phenomenon, as something that has aesthetic merit, that we're supposed to sort of grasp creatively, as it were? Now, when I say that these are two different ways of approaching the teachings, as philosophy on the one hand or literature or poetry on the other, to an extent I'm making a false dichotomy here, and I want to make that clear at the beginning, because I know a number of you will probably say, well, wait a second, can't we understand these both ways? And of course you can. You can understand all of the Buddhist Dharma, you can understand or approach the Buddhist teachings as both, as philosophy and as poetry or literature. However, at least in one sutta of the Pāli tradition, this is actually expressed as a dichotomy, that there are two ways to approach the teachings. And so I think we should look at that sutta just to sort of see what it has to tell us and how we might learn from it. Now, there are a couple of asterisks here, a couple of caveats that I'll get to at the end of this talk. So there are things we'll have to keep in mind for later on. But in any event, what this sutta does is it expresses the fact that there are two kinds of assemblies. And this sutta comes in a part of one of the Nikayas, one of the volumes of the Buddha's discourses, in which he's discussing a number of comparisons between different kinds of assemblies of monastics. And in this particular sutta, the Buddha is discussing two assemblies of monastics who approach the Buddha's discourses, the Buddha's teachings, in different ways. That is, they have different interests when it comes to hearing Dharma talks. The first kind of assembly basically doesn't want to hear very deep and profound Dharma talks. However, the Buddha goes on to say, when discourses composed by poets, poetry beautiful in words and phrases, composed by outsiders or even spoken by disciples, are being recited, the mendicants do want to listen. That is, these mendicants, these monastics, they're interested in hearing poetry. They're interested in hearing beautiful language. They're interested in people who recite the Dharma in a way that's very compelling, we might say very rhetorically gifted. However, and these monastics, the Buddha goes on to say, believe that they've understood what's being said. They believe that they have, when the talk is over, they believe that they've really grasped the point of the talk. However, when the talk is over, there are certain things that they refrain from doing or don't do. He goes on. When they've learned those teachings, the monastics don't question or examine each other, saying, why does it say this? What does that mean? So they don't clarify what's unclear or reveal what's obscure, or dispel doubt regarding the many doubtful matters. And this may indeed be the problem or the difference between understanding a Dharma talk or understanding anything as, let's say, philosophy as versus literature or poetry. In the case of understanding it as literature or poetry, there may be indeed many possible meanings. That is to say, when you're given a poetic stanza or poetic words, they may have no particular meaning or many meanings. The meanings may be obscure and difficult to understand, and it may be up to us, in a sense, to creatively interpret what the poetry has to say. Indeed, that's one of the things that makes literature so endlessly fascinating, is that each of us comes at it creatively to understand it from our own point of view, and there isn't really a right answer as to why it says this in this particular place, or not necessarily. Oftentimes in poetry or in literature, there's no specific answer as to why something is said some particular way. There are instead a multitude of possible answers, maybe even an infinity of possible answers as to why a particular word is used in a particular place. And words can have multiple meanings, multiple interpretations. And they're all, if we're taking these in a literary way, potentially equally valid. Now, of course, there are going to be some interpretations that we can say are not valid, but even so, there may be indeed an infinite number that are valid, or at least a very, very large number of ways of interpreting things. And so in a literary context, if we want to ask, what does this mean? There isn't necessarily going to be a single answer. Indeed, in virtually all cases, there won't be a single answer. Instead, there'll be any number of possible answers, and basically it's up to us creatively to come up with our own answer in a particular place. On the other hand, with philosophy, at least ideally, there is an answer. There are answers to be given in particular about particular phrases or sentences or claims. There are particular ways, at least again ideally, that they're supposed to be understood. And this is what the Buddha was getting at in this stanza, here in this paragraph, where he's saying these people don't ask what this means or why this is said. Well, if they had asked, they would indeed come to a particular answer. And so philosophy in this sense is really not supposed to be creative in the same way that literature is. That is, we don't come at it creatively as listeners or as readers. We come at it trying to understand precisely what it says and what it means, because there is going to be an answer. Now, the Buddha then compares this assembly of monastics, the one that we've just been discussing, he compares it with a different assembly of monastics, one that he says is actually interested in very deep and profound discourses that the Buddha gives. And the Buddha goes on to say, when they've learned those teachings, they question and examine each other, saying, why does it say this? What does that mean? So they clarify what's unclear, reveal what's obscure, and dispel doubt regarding the many doubtful matters. This is called an assembly educated in questioning, not in fancy or vain or bombastic talk. Now, there's a word here that's translated by various translators, either as fancy or as vain or as bombastic. Now, we might say as talk that's rhetorically skilled. And here again, we should suppose that there are indeed answers to these questions as to why it says this, why the Buddha said this particular thing in this place, why this particular simile is used right here. There are particular reasons to be given as to what this means. And that is, again, a thing that distinguishes the interpreting these as philosophy rather than as literature. And indeed, this is a point that the ancient Greek philosopher Plato would have agreed with. He said something indeed very similar, making the point that there was a distinction between philosophy on the one hand and what he called rhetoric on the other, where philosophy is trying to get at the actual facts about things. In other words, when you say something in a philosophical context, it has a particular interpretation. It's supposed to be saying a particular thing. It's making particular truth claims. They're supposed to be, at least ought to be, supported by evidence. Whereas with rhetoric, you're trying to convince people with, we might say, fancy words, but these words can be interpreted many different ways. There's no necessarily easy way to understand what they really mean, and so people can be easily convinced without actually understanding the matter at hand. Now, having said this, there are a couple of important caveats, a couple of important asterisks that I have to give here. The first one is that, of course, all Buddhist Dharma, all of the Buddhist texts that we have, can be interpreted as literature just as much as they can be interpreted as philosophy. And many of them are indeed written in verse form and not only can be interpreted as poetry, but in fact are poetry. There's a lot of poetry within the early Buddhist texts. And the same is absolutely true of Plato, of Plato's texts as well. They're written, actually, many of them in, as I recall, poetic meter, and certainly written as literature and can be interpreted that way. So we have to be very careful here not to over-interpret what is being said. One way to see this is that the early Buddhist texts can be interpreted at many different levels. One way that this has been discussed recently, and I discussed it a while back in my video on dependent origination, I'll leave a link to that video down below, is that some of the early, we'll recall, the chain of dependent origination is a 12-link chain of causes and conditions where each stage conditions the next. And this is a way that we go from ignorance at the one end to dukkha, to suffering or unsatisfactoriness at the other. It's a very deep and profound and complex teaching, but some recent scholars have pointed out that the early stages in this 12-link chain seem in certain ways to mirror ideas that had come from centuries before in the Vedas. In other words, that the Buddha, by constructing this chain in this way, was echoing certain ideas out of the Vedas, and in fact, perhaps even satirizing them, making a certain kind of wry fun of the way the Vedas interpret the world. At least this is the way that one scholar has interpreted this, and with some reason. And so we can see if that is correct, then the Buddha would have been giving this 12-link chain in a way with certain connotations that were supposed to perhaps make his audience smile and maybe think, okay, yes, I understand how he's reinterpreting what the Vedas had already said. So there can be different levels at which we read or understand the Buddhist Dharma, not always as everything on the surface level. But nevertheless, the idea here is that if there are such quote-unquote hidden allusions here, alluding to, let's say, other belief systems of his day and satirizing them and whatever, if there are such allusions, they're allusions that should be understood for what they are and seen because they have themselves a dharmic point. In other words, if the Buddha actually intended it this way, then his intention was actually to satirize the Vedas, to say, I've understood what you're saying, but I have a more accurate way of getting across the same kind of information by putting it within my own system of the Buddha Dharma as opposed to the Vedas. Now, the second caveat here is that this particular sutta, so far as I can tell, doesn't have any parallels in other recensions. In other words, most of the early suttas have parallels in other, in Chinese or other early languages, which suggests that the material in them goes back to a stage that is pre-sectarian, before the split into the different Buddhist sects. This particular sutta, the one we've been discussing, however, doesn't have any parallels, which suggests, although it doesn't absolutely prove by any means, it suggests that it may be a later sutta, a sutta from perhaps composed after the split into sects, in which case it might be itself a sectarian sutta, one that was perhaps meant to satirize or argue against certain more, shall we say, modernizing strains within Buddhism at the time, and perhaps even with some influence of outside ideas. It's hard to say because I don't really know the facts about this particular sutta, and I don't know that anybody does. There's obviously a very limited amount of information we can get about any particular sutta. But in any event, the point here that this sutta is making, I think, is nevertheless a very good one, which is that when we have doubts or concerns, questions about a particular teaching that we hear in Buddhism and early Buddhism, we shouldn't simply let those doubts fester. We shouldn't assume that the sutta was meant to have an infinite number of interpretations and we should just get creative about how we interpret it. We should at least begin by trying to understand specifically why it says what it says, either by asking somebody you know, perhaps by watching one of my videos, by reading some books. Now, having understood what is meant by a particular claim doesn't necessarily mean we have to accept it. The Buddha said that we should accept things having seen them for ourselves. But nevertheless, we have to begin at least by approaching the suttas with the idea of dispelling or trying to dispel our doubts about them. And I did an earlier video on that very point on ways to dispel doubts, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, take a look over at my Patreon page and see if you want to help us out. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.